I was checking the cattle water trough when I saw a bright red sign stuck right in front of my ranch gate. Pilgrim's property, no trespassing, RDA authorized. Melody Baxter stood next to her pink pickup truck, holding her phone up recording a video for her blog. Hi y'all! Today I'm blocking illegal access that's destroying our rural property values. Wait a minute. Was she talking about blocking the ranch gate that my family had owned for 60 years? Comment below and let me know what state you're watching from. I bet plenty of ranchers have dealt with this kind of city transplant before. The Miller Ranch sits on 65 acres of prime Texas countryside outside the small town of Millbrook. My grandfather bought this land back in 1962, and it's been our family's working cattle ranch ever since. I remember my grandfather standing at this very gate wearing his old straw hat, holding a cheap cigar, saying, "Son, land is the only thing they ain't making more of. What we keep is what we keep for our bloodline." The heavy steel gate at our main road entrance has welcomed 3 generations of Millers, along with neighbors, friends, and anyone who needed to cut through our northeast corner to avoid the 12-mile detour around town. That dirt road shortcut connects County Road 45 with Highway 287. Melody Baxter moved here from Dallas 2 years ago, bought herself a 2-acre ranchette with a fake rustic house, and immediately started complaining about everything from cattle smells to the sound of tractors at dawn. Melody wore fake farm clothes, looking like she'd stepped out of a rural tourism poster. She got herself elected president of the RDA 8 months ago with promises to bring this backwards area into the 21st century. What that really meant was converting our traditional ranching community into upscale rural subdivisions where city folks could play cowboy on weekends without dealing with actual ranch operations. "Ma'am," I called out, walking toward the gate with my border collies Duke and Ranger trailing behind me. "That's my family's ranch gate you're blocking there." Melody turned toward me with that practiced smile she probably learned in real estate school. "Oh, Hank, perfect timing," she chirped, keeping her phone camera rolling. "I was just explaining to my followers how we're reclaiming this public easement for community benefit. The RDA has determined that allowing unrestricted access through private property creates liability issues and decreases overall property values in our development area." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process the corporate speak she'd just unleashed. This woman was talking about my land, my gate, and my family's 60-year tradition of neighborly cooperation, like she had some kind of authority over it. The memory of my grandfather's weathered hands opening this same gate every morning for 40 years burned in my chest like a hot coal. "This isn't a public easement, Melody," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "This is private property that's been in my family since before you were born. That shortcut exists because we allow it, not because anyone has a legal right to it." She laughed, actually laughed, and turned her phone camera to capture my reaction. "Oh honey, that's where you're wrong. The RDA has conducted a thorough review of rural access rights and we've determined that this route qualifies as a community necessity. We're implementing proper oversight to protect everyone's interests." The absolute audacity of this woman was staggering. She'd moved here from the city, bought a tiny plot of land, gotten herself elected to a position with zero actual authority over ranch operations, and now she thought she could dictate terms to families who'd been working this land for decades. My trail camera mounted on the oak tree near the gate had captured her using our shortcut for months before this power play. "You know what, Melody?" I said, pulling out my own phone. "You're absolutely right about one thing. We need proper documentation of who's been using this route and when." I snapped a photo of her standing next to her sign, making sure to capture her pink pickup truck and the RDA authorization she claimed to have. "I think my trail camera footage is going to be very educational for everyone involved." Her confident smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, I hope you're prepared to face the consequences of obstructing community access," she said, climbing back into her pink truck. "The RDA takes property rights very seriously, and we won't hesitate to impose fines." She drove off in a cloud of dust, leaving her red sign planted firmly in front of my gate like some kind of declaration of war. I stood there for a long moment, watching her taillights disappear down County Road 45, feeling the weight of 3 generations of Miller family history pressing on my shoulders. Duke and Ranger looked up at me expectantly, probably wondering why we weren't moving the cattle like we'd planned. Instead, I found myself staring at that ridiculous red sign and thinking about my grandfather's stories of defending this land against developers and bureaucrats who thought they knew better than the people who actually worked it. He'd always told me that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's not easy. Looking at that trail camera, I realized I had more ammunition than Melody could possibly imagine. She'd just blocked the ranch gate that had belonged to my family for 60 years. But I had 60 years of family history, 2 years of trail camera footage, and a growing suspicion that Melody Baxter had been using our shortcut long before she decided to block it for everyone else. The land my grandfather had fought to keep was now mine to defend. Game on. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen this much excitement since the high school football team made it to state championships 3 years ago. More than 20 rural property owners packed into the meeting room, most of them actual ranchers and farmers who'd been working this land since before Melody knew the difference between a bull and a steer. The air conditioning struggled against the Texas heat and the collective frustration of people who'd driven miles to hear why some city transplant thought she could dictate how they used their own property. Melody had set up a PowerPoint presentation on a borrowed projector. She wore a different outfit tonight, a blazer over jeans with boots that had probably never seen real ranch work, trying to look professional and rural at the same time. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency meeting," she began, clicking to her first slide. "Tonight, we're addressing critical rural modernization issues that affect property values throughout our development area." Melody talked about infrastructure like she was preparing to rebuild the Pentagon. Her slides were filled with buzzwords like liability mitigation and sustainable infrastructure, but completely meaningless to actual rural folks. What it boiled down to was Melody's belief that traditional ranching operations were messy, smelly, and inconsistent with her vision of upscale country living. She claimed that allowing unrestricted access through private property created insurance liabilities and decreased property values. The fact that most of the people in that room had been successfully managing their land for decades without her help seemed completely lost on her. "Now, I know some of you have concerns about implementing proper oversight," Melody continued, "but we have to think about the bigger picture here. The RDA has a responsibility to protect all residents, not just those who've been grandfathered into outdated arrangements." Her presentation was all flash and no substance, like everything else about her transformation from city real estate agent to rural authority figure. That's when June Caldwell stood up. At 67, June had forgotten more about rural property management than Melody would ever learn. She'd been the RDA president for 15 years before stepping down, and she knew exactly what authority the organization did and didn't have. "Melody, honey," June said in that sweet voice that every smart person in the room recognized as a warning, "could you please explain exactly what legal authority the RDA has to block access to private property? Because I've read our bylaws pretty carefully, and I don't recall anything about controlling traffic on land we don't own." The room got very quiet. Melody's confident smile flickered, and she shuffled through her notes like she was looking for the right answer. "Well, June, the RDA operates under state guidelines for rural development associations, and we have clear authority to address community concerns that affect property values and safety." June nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "And which specific state statute gives us authority over privately owned ranch roads that have been in use since before the RDA existed?" You could practically hear the crickets chirping. Melody's face flushed red, and she started talking faster, throwing around more corporate buzzwords and vague references to professional consultation and legal review. What she couldn't do was cite a single law, regulation, or legal precedent that gave her the authority to block access to my family's ranch gate. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that she was making this up as she went along. Travis Hunt raised his hand from the back of the room. As a part-time rancher and electrical contractor, Travis had dealt with his share of bureaucratic nonsense, including Melody's previous harassment about his unsightly agricultural equipment. "I've got a question too," he said. "If the RETA is so concerned about liability and property values, why are we targeting working ranch operations instead of addressing actual problems like the illegal dumping on Miller Creek Road that got a murmur of agreement from the crowd?" The meeting was slipping away from her, and she knew it. "Look," she said, raising her voice to regain control. "I understand that change is difficult, but we can't let sentiment override common sense. The Miller Ranch shortcut has become a community liability, and the RDA has voted to implement proper security assessment and oversight." Her desperation was starting to show through the polished exterior she'd maintained throughout her presidency. "When did we vote on that?" asked Bill Morrison, who owned the horse property adjacent to mine. "Because I don't remember getting notice of any vote about blocking ranch roads." Melody's smile was getting more strained by the minute. "It was an emergency decision made by the executive committee based on urgent safety concerns," she replied. "We've already contracted with a professional security company to assess unauthorized usage of the disputed area." June Caldwell stood up again, and her sweet voice had definitely shifted into warning mode. Melody, I think you need to review the RDA bylaws very carefully before your next meeting, and I'd recommend consulting with an actual attorney instead of making legal claims you can't support. As the meeting broke up, I noticed several ranchers gathering around June, and I caught snippets of conversation about calling a special election and reviewing Melody's authority. Travis Hunt caught up with me in the parking lot, shaking his head in amazement. "That woman has lost her mind," he said. "She tried to fine me $300 last month for having a cattle trailer parked in my own driveway." We both laughed, but there was no humor in it. We were dealing with someone who genuinely believed she had the authority to control how longtime residents use their own property. Driving home past my blocked ranch gate, I saw Melody's red sign glowing in my headlights like some kind of evil beacon. What she didn't know was that my trail camera had infrared capability, and it had been capturing some very interesting nighttime activity around my property. "Security company arrives tomorrow to assess unauthorized usage. Time to defend my ranch." The next morning brought 3 men in matching polo shirts and clipboards, representing something called Rural Security Solutions. They set up a folding table right next to my ranch gate and started documenting every vehicle that passed by, like they were conducting some kind of traffic study on my family's private property. I watched them from my kitchen window while I drank my coffee, wondering if Melody had actually found people willing to take money for this ridiculous charade. The head security guy, his name tag said Steve, knocked on my door around 8 o'clock with a clipboard full of official-looking forms. "Morning, sir," he said, trying to sound professional. "We're conducting an assessment of vehicular usage patterns for the Rural Development Association. We'll need you to provide documentation of authorized access for this property." I looked at him for a long moment, then asked the obvious question, "Are you asking me to provide documentation for access to my own ranch?" "Son," I said, keeping my voice friendly but firm, "I've been living on this ranch for 15 years, and my family has owned it for 60. The only documentation I need is the deed in my filing cabinet and the tax bills I pay every year. Now, if you want to stand on the public road and count cars, that's your business, but if you set foot on my property without permission, we're going to have a very different conversation." Steve nodded quickly and retreated to his folding table, where he spent the rest of the morning looking increasingly uncomfortable. By noon, I'd made my decision. Instead of fighting Melody's fake authority over a shortcut that existed at my family's discretion, I was going to exercise my real authority as a property owner and build a proper ranch fence. Walking the property line, I found myself at the old oak tree where I'd hidden as a boy, listening to my grandfather tell stories about fighting with land developers back in the 1970s. The memories strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about a shortcut. It was about protecting the legacy that 3 generations of Millers had built on this land. I called Travis Hunt first, since he'd dealt with Melody's harassment before and understood what we were up against. "You gonna fence the shortcut?" he asked when I explained my plan. "Hank, that's brilliant! She can't claim community access rights to property that's clearly marked as private agricultural land." June Caldwell was my second call. As the former RDA president, she knew exactly what authority Melody did and didn't have, and she'd been quietly collecting evidence of election irregularities since the meeting. "Hank, honey, that's the smartest thing I've heard all week," she said when I outlined my fencing plan. "Agricultural fencing is completely within your rights as a property owner, and there's not a thing the RDA can do to stop you." The more I thought about it, the more perfect the plan became. A proper ranch fence would clearly establish property boundaries, protect my cattle operations from interference, and be positioned exactly along my property line, which happened to cut right through the middle of the shortcut that Melody was so concerned about controlling. I spent the afternoon walking the fence line with Duke and Ranger, using GPS coordinates from the county surveyor's office to mark exactly where the boundary ran. The shortcut that everyone had been using for decades actually crossed about 300 feet of my property, cutting diagonally through the northeast corner of my pasture. Once a fence went up along the actual property line, that shortcut would be completely blocked, forcing traffic back onto the public roads where it legally belonged. Pete Morrison came out that evening to look at the project. He was a weathered man in his 50s who'd been building ranch fences since before Melody knew Texas existed. Pete recommended standard agricultural fencing, sturdy and specifically designed to block the path. "I can have a crew here Monday morning and finish the whole job in 2 days, he said after walking the line. "What about permits?" I asked, knowing Melody would look for any excuse to cause trouble. Pete laughed and shook his head. "No permits needed for agricultural fencing on private property." That night, I reviewed my trail camera footage, looking for evidence of who had been using the shortcut and when. The camera had captured Melody's pink pickup truck using my shortcut at least twice a week for the past 6 months, long before she'd decided to block it for everyone else. The timestamp on the videos showed her using the route as recently as last Tuesday, 3 days before she'd planted her public property sign and started talking about unauthorized access. The irony was perfect. The woman claiming authority to control access to my property had been using that access without permission for months. The security team packed up their folding table around sunset, probably realizing that sitting in the Texas heat all day to count cars wasn't the most productive use of their time. But as they loaded their equipment, I noticed Steve taking photos of my property, particularly the areas where I'd marked the fence line with survey flags. It looked like Melody was planning something, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to be as simple as accepting that I had the right to fence my own land. Melody hired private investigators to document trespassing. She's about to learn about ranch justice. The harassment started early Monday morning when Pete Morrison's crew arrived to begin fence installation. 3 pickup trucks loaded with steel posts, welded wire panels, and concrete had barely turned into my driveway when Steve and his security team showed up to document unauthorized construction activity. They set up their folding table right at the edge of my property line and started taking photos of everything: the fence materials, the work crew, my ranch house, and even my cattle grazing in the far pasture. "Morning, Steve," I called out as Pete's crew unloaded their equipment. "Beautiful day for building a fence on my own property." Steve consulted his clipboard nervously, then walked over with an official-looking form. "Sir, we've received reports of unauthorized construction that may impact community access routes. I'm going to need to see permits and documentation for any structures being built in this area." I looked at the form he was holding. It was some kind of made-up rural construction compliance document that had no legal standing whatsoever. "Steve," I said patiently, "this is agricultural fencing on private property for livestock management. I don't need permits to build a fence on my own land, and I sure don't need permission from a security company that somebody hired to sit on the public road." Pete Morrison overheard the conversation and walked over with a grin on his weathered face. "Son, I've been building ranch fences in this county for 20 years, and I've never needed permission from anybody except the landowner. This here's standard agricultural construction, completely legal and properly executed." But Steve wasn't backing down. He got on his radio and called someone, probably Melody, to report the fence construction. Within an hour, we had county officials, code enforcement officers, and even a sheriff's deputy showing up to investigate reports of illegal construction blocking community access. It would have been impressive if it hadn't been so ridiculous. Every single official who looked at the project confirmed that agricultural fencing on private property was completely legal and required no permits or approvals. The real problem started when Pete's crew tried to bring in the concrete mixer to set the steel posts. Steve positioned himself right at the edge of my driveway, claiming he needed to document all vehicle movements related to the construction project. When the concrete truck tried to turn in, Steve stepped directly into the path and demanded to see authorization for heavy equipment operation. The driver, a patient man named Carlos who'd been delivering concrete for 15 years, finally had to call his supervisor to figure out what to do about the crazy man blocking access to a paying customer's property. "This is harassment," Pete told me as we watched Steve photographing serial numbers on fence posts. "I've never seen anything like this in all my years of ranch work. That woman has lost her mind if she thinks she can stop legal construction with rent-a-cops and clipboards." The crew was getting frustrated, and I couldn't blame them. They were trying to do honest work on a legitimate project, and instead they were being treated like criminals by someone with no actual authority to interfere. The situation escalated around noon when my veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, tried to reach a sick cow in my back pasture. Steve's security team stopped her at the gate, demanding documentation and claiming they needed to verify authorized access for emergency situations. Dr. Mitchell, who'd been treating livestock in this county for 10 years, was not impressed. "Young man," she said in the voice she usually reserved for difficult animals, "I have a cow with a possible twisted gut, and every minute you waste could cost this animal its life. Now move your table, or I'll move it for you." That's when I lost my temper. Blocking construction workers was annoying, but interfering with veterinary care for sick animals crossed a line that no decent rancher would tolerate. "Steve," I called out, walking toward the gate with Duke and Ranger at my heels, "you've got exactly 10 seconds to get out of that lady's way before I call the real sheriff and have you arrested for interfering with emergency animal care." The authority in my voice must have gotten through to him, because he stepped aside and let Dr. Mitchell through. But the damage was done. My cattle operations were being disrupted by people who had no business being on my property. The harassment continued all afternoon. Every delivery truck, every piece of equipment, every person who needed access to my ranch was stopped, questioned, and photographed by Steve's team. They claimed to be documenting violations and gathering evidence, but what they were really doing was making it as difficult as possible for me to conduct normal ranching operations. It was psychological warfare designed to frustrate me into giving up and accepting Melody's authority over my own property. By evening, Pete's crew had managed to install about half the fence posts, despite the constant interference. The steel posts stood 8 feet tall in a straight line along my property boundary, clearly marking where my land ended and the public road began. The shortcut that people had been using for decades now had a row of steel barriers cutting right through the middle of it, making it obvious that continued use would require trespassing on clearly marked private property. Travis Hunt stopped by around sunset to check on the progress and see how the harassment was affecting the work. "They're trying to wear you down," he said, watching Steve pack up his folding table for the night. "Melody's hoping you'll get tired of dealing with this nonsense and just give up. But look at that fence line. It's beautiful. Professional work, clearly marked boundaries, completely legal. She can't fight property rights with rent-a-cops." As Travis and I talked, I noticed fresh tire tracks around my property that didn't match any of the vehicles that had been there during the day. Someone had been driving around my ranch after dark, probably trying to find weaknesses in my fence line or ways to interfere with the construction. My trail camera would have captured whoever it was, and I had a strong suspicion about the color of their pickup truck. The next morning would bring the completion of the fence, and with it the end of the shortcut that Melody was so determined to control. But looking at those tire tracks in the moonlight, I realized this wasn't over. Melody had invested too much time and effort in her power play to give up just because I'd built a legal fence on my own property. The real confrontation was still coming. Delivery truck arrives, 200 fence posts, professional installation crew. War has officially begun. Tuesday morning brought Pete Morrison's full crew back to finish the fence, along with 3 flatbed trucks loaded with welded wire panels and enough barbed wire to secure a military installation. The sight of that convoy turning into my driveway must have been visible for miles, and I noticed several neighbors stopping along the public road to watch the proceedings. Word had gotten around about Melody's harassment campaign, and the local ranching community was paying attention to see how this battle would play out. Steve's security team showed up even earlier than the fence crew, setting up their folding table and cameras like they were documenting some kind of crime scene. But this time they had company. Melody herself arrived in her pink pickup truck, wearing designer jeans and a country-strong t-shirt that probably cost more than most ranch hands made in a week. She parked right at the edge of my property line and started taking her own photos and videos, probably for another one of her blog posts about rural modernization challenges. The fence installation was like watching a well-choreographed dance. Pete's crew had been doing this kind of work for years, and they moved with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Steel posts went into concrete footings, welded wire panels stretched tight between supports, and barbed wire strung along the top to clearly mark this as agricultural property. The fence line followed my property boundary exactly, cutting diagonally through the shortcut route that had been the source of all this trouble. "That's a beautiful fence," said June Caldwell, who'd driven over to witness the completion of the project. "Professional work, proper materials, clearly marking private agricultural property. Melody can't complain about the quality or the legality." June had brought her own camera to document the installation, creating a record that would be useful if Melody tried to claim the fence was improperly constructed or positioned. "I've also been doing some research into RDA election procedures," she added quietly. "Found some very interesting irregularities in how Melody got herself elected." The psychological impact of the fence was immediate and obvious. What had been an informal dirt road cutting through my pasture was now clearly divided into public road on one side and private ranch property on the other. The steel posts and wire panels created a visual barrier that made it impossible for anyone to claim they didn't know they were trespassing. More importantly, the fence completely blocked vehicle access to the shortcut, forcing all traffic back onto the official roads where it belonged. Travis Hunt arrived around noon with his own pickup truck loaded with barbecue supplies. "Figured we should celebrate proper property rights with proper Texas barbecue," he said, firing up a portable grill near the fence line. "Besides, I wanted to see Melody's face when she realizes her shortcut dreams just died." Word spread quickly through the ranching community, and by afternoon we had a dozen neighbors gathered around the fence line, eating brisket and talking about the importance of standing up to bureaucratic overreach. The community support was overwhelming. Bill Morrison brought his wife and kids to see the fence construction. The Peterson family drove over from their horse ranch 3 miles away. Even old Charlie Watson, who had been ranching in this county since the 1970s, showed up to shake my hand and tell stories about fighting developers and bureaucrats back in his day. "Sometimes you gotta draw a line," Charlie said, slapping one of my new fence posts. "This here's a good, solid line." Melody's reaction to the fence completion was exactly what I'd expected. She spent the afternoon pacing back and forth along the public road, taking photos from every angle and making phone calls that grew increasingly agitated. I could hear her talking about illegal barriers and community access rights, but her voice had lost the confident tone she'd used during the RDA meeting. She was realizing that all her talk about authority and oversight meant nothing when confronted with actual property rights and properly constructed agricultural fencing. The moment of truth came around 4 o'clock, when the first vehicle tried to use the shortcut after the fence was completed. A delivery truck came down County Road 45, slowed down at the usual turnoff point, and found its way blocked by 8 feet of steel posts and welded wire. The driver had to continue to the main intersection, adding 12 miles to his route and 15 minutes to his delivery time. That truck was followed by a school bus, 2 pickup trucks, and a county maintenance vehicle, all forced to take the long way around because the shortcut they'd relied on for years was now properly fenced off. "How does it feel, Melody?" Travis called out as we watched the 4th vehicle of the hour turn around and head back to the main road. All those people using Hank's property for free, and now they have to follow the same rules as everyone else. Melody's face flushed red, and she stormed over to where we were standing near the fence line. "This is obstruction of community access," she shouted. "That shortcut is essential infrastructure, and you can't just block it with illegal barriers." "Ma'am," Pete Morrison said politely, "this is standard agricultural fencing on private property, built to county specifications and completely within the landowner's rights. Every post is on the correct side of the property line, every panel meets agricultural standards, and every inch of this fence is legal under Texas property law." Melody sputtered for a moment, then pulled out her phone to make another angry call to someone who probably couldn't help her any more than the county officials who'd already confirmed the fence's legality. As the sun set over the Miller Ranch, the new fence line stood proud and straight, clearly marking the boundary between public road and private agricultural property. The shortcut that had caused all this trouble was now permanently blocked, eliminating any confusion about access rights or community usage. Melody's pink pickup truck was parked at the edge of the road, and I could see her inside making more phone calls, probably trying to find someone with enough authority to force me to tear down a legal fence on my own property. "Do you know what the best part is?" June said as we watched the last of the neighbors head home. "Every person who supported this fence project is a registered voter in the RDA district. Melody's been so focused on harassing you that she forgot she needs community support to stay in office." That was a comforting thought, but looking at Melody's truck still parked by the roadside, I had a feeling this confrontation was far from over. June shows me an online order. Melody just bought heavy-duty wire cutters, but after tonight's fence celebration, she might need bail money instead. The fence had been complete for exactly 18 hours when Melody Baxter completely lost her mind. I was checking the late-night cattle when I heard the roar of an engine being pushed far beyond its limits, followed by the distinctive sound of a vehicle crashing through steel fence posts. By the time I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the commotion, Melody's pink pickup truck was nose first in the cattle guard ditch, steam pouring from its radiator and fence posts scattered across 20 feet of what used to be my property line. The crash scene looked like something from a demolition derby. Melody had apparently floored her truck straight into the center section of my new fence, taking out 4 steel posts and 30 feet of welded wire panels before the cattle guard ditch stopped her forward momentum. The truck's front end was crumpled like an accordion, and Melody herself was trapped inside, honking the horn frantically and screaming about illegal barriers and community rights. Duke and Ranger were barking at the chaos, and my cattle had scattered to the far end of the pasture, spooked by the noise and commotion. "Ma'am, are you injured?" I called out, approaching the truck carefully in case she was hurt or the vehicle was unstable. Melody turned toward me with wild eyes, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled and her country-strong t-shirt torn. "You can't block community access," she screamed through the windshield. "That shortcut is essential infrastructure. I have rights." The smell of alcohol was strong enough to detect from several feet away, and it was obvious that liquid courage had played a role in her decision to attack my fence with her vehicle. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, keeping my distance from the wreckage while I waited for emergency services. 911, what's your emergency?" came the dispatcher's voice. This is Hank Miller at the Miller Ranch on County Road 45. A vehicle has crashed through my property fence and the driver appears to be intoxicated and possibly injured. Within minutes, I could hear sirens approaching from town, and I saw headlights from several neighbors who'd heard the crash and come to investigate. Travis Hunt arrived first, pulling up in his truck with his emergency flashers on. "What in the hell happened here?" he asked, taking in the scene of destruction. "Melody happened," I replied, pointing to the pink truck embedded in my cattle guard. She drove straight through the fence at about 40 miles per hour. Travis whistled low and shook his head. "Well, I guess that's one way to test the strength of your fence posts. Pete Morrison builds them tough, but they're not designed to stop a drunk driver in a pickup truck." The sheriff's deputy arrived next, followed by an ambulance and a fire truck. Deputy Martinez was a professional who dealt with plenty of rural disturbances, but even he seemed surprised by the scene in front of him. "Sir, can you tell me what happened here?" he asked, pulling out his notebook. I gave him a quick rundown of the fence construction, Melody's harassment campaign, and the crash itself. "The vehicle came from the public road, crossed the ditch, and struck your fence," he confirmed. "Yes, sir," I replied. "Destroyed about 30 feet of agricultural fencing that was completed yesterday." Meanwhile, the paramedics were trying to extract Melody from her truck and assess her condition. She was conscious and combative, continuing to rant about community access rights and illegal barriers even as they checked her for injuries. "That fence is blocking essential infrastructure," she kept repeating. "I have every right to maintain community access." The paramedics exchanged glances that clearly said they'd dealt with intoxicated patients before, but probably not ones who crashed into fences while claiming governmental authority. June Caldwell arrived as the paramedics were loading Melody into the ambulance, still screaming about property rights and rural development. "Dear Lord," June said, surveying the wreckage. "That woman has completely lost her mind." She pulled out her phone and started taking photos of the crash scene, the destroyed fence, and the tire tracks that clearly showed Melody had accelerated before impact. "This is going to be very useful evidence for the RDA board meeting," she said grimly. Deputy Martinez conducted a field sobriety test that Melody failed spectacularly, confirming what the smell of alcohol had already suggested. Her blood alcohol level was well above the legal limit, and combined with the property damage and reckless driving, she was looking at serious criminal charges. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for driving while intoxicated, criminal mischief and reckless endangerment," Deputy Martinez announced as he handcuffed her to the ambulance gurney. "You have the right to remain silent." The crash had attracted quite an audience by now. Word travels fast in rural communities, and half the county seemed to be driving by to see what had happened. Travis had started directing traffic around the emergency vehicles, while June documented everything with her camera. Pete Morrison arrived with a crew to assess the fence damage and make emergency repairs to keep my cattle contained. "Good news is, the posts held up pretty well," he said after examining the wreckage. "Bad news is, you're going to need 4 new posts and 30 feet of panels." As the ambulance carried Melody away to face blood tests and criminal charges, I stood looking at the destruction she'd caused and feeling a mix of satisfaction and amazement. The woman who'd spent weeks claiming authority over my property had just provided the most dramatic possible proof that she had no respect for property rights, no understanding of legal boundaries, and no business being in any position of responsibility. Her pink pickup truck would be towed away as evidence, and the fence she'd tried to destroy would be rebuilt stronger than before. "You know what this means, don't you?" Travis said as we watched the tow truck hook up to Melody's demolished pickup. "She just handed you the perfect evidence for any legal action you want to take. Drunk driving, property destruction, trespassing, the whole package." June nodded in agreement. "And the RDA board meeting next week is going to be very interesting. Hard to claim community leadership when you're facing criminal charges for destroying your neighbor's fence." The irony was perfect. Melody had spent so much energy trying to control access to my property that she'd ended up providing the most dramatic demonstration possible of why property rights needed to be protected. Her truck rampage had eliminated any sympathy she might have had from neutral neighbors, and it gave me all the evidence I needed to pursue damages for the fence destruction and harassment. Sheriff arrives to find Melody trapped in truck, surrounded by destroyed fence, with breathalyzer test pending. The aftermath of Melody's midnight truck rampage spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By morning, everyone in the county knew that the RDA president had driven drunk through a neighbor's fence while screaming about community access rights. The story got better with each telling, and by the time the weekly paper hit the stands, Melody Baxter had become the punchline of jokes from coffee shops to feed stores throughout rural Texas. The emergency RDA board meeting was called for the following Saturday, and the Millbrook Community Center was packed beyond capacity. Every rancher, farmer, and rural property owner in the district showed up to witness what everyone knew would be Melody's political execution. The evidence was overwhelming. Criminal charges for drunk driving and property destruction, video footage of her harassment campaign, and documentation of her unauthorized exercise of powers that the RDA had never possessed in the first place. June Caldwell had spent the week gathering evidence and organizing community support. "I've got signed statements from 12 property owners documenting Melody's harassment," she told me before the meeting, plus photos of the fence destruction, copies of the fake authority documents she was using, and a legal opinion from a real attorney about RDA powers and limitations. June had also discovered that Melody's election had involved irregularities in voter notification and ballot counting, providing additional grounds for removing her from office. The meeting started with Melody herself, released on bail but facing trial for multiple criminal charges. She looked haggard and defeated, wearing a simple blouse instead of her usual country costume. Her pink pickup truck had been totaled in the crash, and she'd been forced to borrow a car from her husband to attend her own political funeral. "I want to address the recent misunderstandings about my actions as RDA president," she began, but her voice lacked the confidence that had characterized her earlier presentations. "Misunderstandings?" interrupted Bill Morrison from the back of the room. "You mean like misunderstanding that you can't block access to private property, or misunderstanding that drunk driving through your neighbor's fence is illegal?" The room erupted in laughter and applause, and Melody's face flushed red with embarrassment. Her prepared speech about community interests and rural development fell apart under the weight of the evidence against her. Travis Hunt stood up to present the ranching community's perspective on Melody's tenure as RDA president. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a woman who moved here from the city 2 years ago, bought a tiny plot of land, and decided she knew better than families who've been working this land for generations. She's harassed longtime residents, made up fake authority, and ended up drunk driving through a neighbor's fence. I think it's time for new leadership." The applause was thunderous and sustained. The vote to remove Melody from office was unanimous among the legitimate RDA members. Even the 2 ranchette owners who'd supported her urban development vision couldn't defend someone facing criminal charges for destroying agricultural property. June Caldwell was elected interim president by acclamation, and her first official act was to formally apologize to me for the harassment I'd endured under Melody's leadership. "The RDA exists to support rural property owners, not to harass them," June announced to the packed room. "We will respect traditional property rights, support agricultural operations, and work with the community instead of against it. Anyone who thinks they can use this organization to push personal agendas or exercise imaginary authority needs to find somewhere else to live." The crowd gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The legal consequences for Melody were swift and comprehensive. She pled guilty to drunk driving, criminal mischief, and trespassing, receiving a fine of $5,000, community service, and a suspended jail sentence. The civil lawsuit for fence damages, harassment, and legal fees cost her another $15,000, plus the requirement to publish a public apology in the county newspaper. Her fake country lifestyle blog was deleted after the backlash from the incident, and the real estate license she'd been using to promote rural development schemes was suspended pending investigation. The property value impact was the opposite of what Melody had predicted. Instead of being hurt by agricultural operations and traditional ranching, the area saw increased interest from people who wanted to live in a community that respected property rights and traditional rural values. My rebuilt fence became a symbol of standing up to bureaucratic overreach, and several neighbors commented that they felt more secure knowing their property rights would be protected against future harassment. The fence itself was rebuilt within a week, stronger and more permanent than before. Pete Morrison used the insurance money from Melody's crash to upgrade the steel posts and add decorative ranch-style gates at both ends of the property line. "This fence will outlast all of us," Pete said as he installed the final panel. "And it'll remind folks for years to come that property rights matter more than fake authority." The shortcut remained permanently closed, and the 12-mile detour became a normal part of life for people traveling between County Road 45 and Highway 287. Surprisingly, most folks adapted without complaint, and some even commented that the slower route through town was more pleasant than racing through ranch property. Emergency services worked out alternative routes that didn't require crossing private land, and school buses adjusted their schedules to accommodate the official roads. 6 months after her midnight truck rampage, Melody quietly moved back to Dallas, selling her ranchette to a retired couple who actually wanted to live in the country instead of trying to change it. Her pink pickup truck became a local legend at the salvage yard, where kids would climb on the wreckage and hear stories about the city woman who thought she could ram her way through ranch property rights. The Miller Ranch returned to peaceful cattle operations, with Duke and Ranger patrolling the fence line and keeping watch over 65 acres of Texas countryside that had been in my family for 60 years. The new gate bore a simple sign, Miller Ranch, established 1962, visitors, welcome by appointment. It was a reminder that real authority comes from respecting the land, the law, and the neighbors who make rural communities work. Sometimes you have to draw a line in the dirt to protect what matters. Sometimes that line needs to be made of steel posts and welded wire. And sometimes, when people try to cross that line with fake authority and pink pickup trucks, they learn the hard way that property rights are stronger than bureaucratic nonsense. The Miller Ranch fence stands proud and permanent, a testament to the idea that standing up for what's right is always worth the fight.